So this presentation looks at some of the key changes in ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016 affecting the production process. My name is Paul Hardiman, Director of Quality Partner. I've been working with quality management systems for 25 years and I'm an IATF witness auditor and trainer. So we're going to take a look at the production process using the turtle diagram. So let's take a look at the input into the production process and try and highlight some of the things that are changing within IATF 16949. Firstly, plant, facility and equipment plans. We need to make sure that we have a plant layout, making sure that we can meet all customer capacity requirements. So capacity is mentioned far more within IATF 16949, and we need to make sure that we've got a plant layout that can make sure that we meet all of those capacity requirements. The second requirement is making sure that in our production process that we've got the capability to meet all government, all safety and all environmental regulations applicable to the country of manufacture and also where we are shipping the product to, that we are meeting all the relevant legal and regulatory requirements. Third and obvious, as part of the input into production, we need to make sure that we understand customer requirements related to the product and the quantity that they're looking for, but also that we understand the applicable customer specific requirements. Now, whereas customer specific requirements have been applicable right since the beginning of ISO TS 16949, there is now even more emphasis on understanding and implementing customer specific requirements within the new IATF automotive specification. So please make sure that in production you have got a clear understanding of the relevant customer specific requirements and you've got people that are competent within those requirements. The next is making sure as an input into the production process that we understand the handling requirements, we understand the packaging requirements, we understand what contamination controls we need to apply within the production process, and we understand the methods of transporting the product through the production process. Again, this is not new, but there's far more emphasis on this, particularly related to contamination control. And the last requirement is about identification and traceability, that we have a process to make sure that we don't just meet the customer identification and traceability requirements, but we have a system for identification and traceability based upon risk. And obviously in that, we're taking into account product safety and the implications if we have to recall product, how we're going to do that and how we're going to be able to identify and trace what product we actually need to recall. So I think there's even more emphasis on the IATF requirement about having an effective system for identification and traceability. So these are some of the things we need to consider as inputs into the production process. So now let's take a look at the output of production. So obviously the key output is that we have product conforming to customer requirements, statutory requirements, regulatory requirements, both in the country that we're manufacturing the product and the country of destination of the product, if we know that. Now, if we're lower down the supply chain, we may not know the final destination of the product, and the standard allows for that. But if we do know the country of destination, it is our responsibility to make sure that we're meeting all the relevant legal requirements for where the product is going to be shipped to. So, the results of the production process. Obviously, we need to make sure that we've got an effective production process to meet the customer requirements, and we've got an efficient production process to meet the organisation defined requirements. So for example, that may be customer PPM, it may be delivery performance, it may be overall equipment efficiency. These measures need to be clearly defined and documented and monitored. But some of the things that we see have changed in IATF 16949 is where we use an alternative process control method. For example, if we have an automatic camera detection system and that doesn't work, and we revert back to a manual control system, the requirement now is that we do a daily review and we look at the results of that daily review to make sure that alternative method is adequate to make sure we're going to supply good product to meet the customer requirements. So that is a new requirement. There is also a new requirement to say we look at customer satisfaction by going and formally review at a defined frequency. We go in to review the customer portals and we go and look at the customer scorecards, if there are any, to check that we are meeting the customer requirements. The next thing that we need to look at is the system audit results, the process audit results, and the product audit results. And we'll see when we look at the auditing presentation that there is more emphasis on the competency of people undertaking audits. And for example, the people that are doing process audits of the manufacturing process, they are competent to use the FMEA to make sure the organisation is complying with the requirements in the FMEA and we're achieving the desired results, and also that they're using the control plan and we're making sure that all the controls that we've got in the control plan have been effectively implemented. Those documents need to be an essential part of undertaking a manufacturing process audit. And indeed, when we're auditing the product, in making sure that the product meets all the specifications that are defined within the control plan. So these are some of the extra emphasis within the results that we need to focus on to make a successful transition. So now let's think about the how part of the turtle diagram for production. So the first thing that when you read IATF 16949, you'll see far more emphasis on having effective contingency plans. Because what the customer wants is 100% on-time delivery in full all of the time. And if there's any potential risk within the process, we need to be managing those risks through having an effective contingency plan. So I would suggest you have a look at your organisation delivery performance. And where you're not meeting 100% on-time delivery, go back and ask the question, why? Have we covered the relevant contingency within our contingency plan? And why didn't our contingency plan work to make sure that we can meet the defined customer requirements? So this is a real opportunity to go make sure that we have got effective contingency plans. The second big change requirement is about rework. Firstly, we need a documented process for rework and repair, and particularly how we're disposing of any non-conforming product that we are unable to rework or repair. We need to make sure that we're disabling that product, that we're making sure that that product that we're disposing of cannot be picked up and used inadvertently. So far more emphasis on understanding the risk within rework and making sure we have effective rework processes. The next big change is about temporary changes of process control. So this is, we will have all our defined controls within our control plan. But there may be events or breakdowns that mean that we cannot use that standard method of process control, and we need to deviate to an alternative process control. What we now need to make sure is that those alternative process controls are really well managed and are linked back to the control plan, and that we understand the risks in those alternative process controls. So this is, I think, one of the fundamental changes that affects production. We also need to decide if we're going to make any changes in production, that we understand the risks in making those changes and we consider the risks before we make the change. So risk-based thinking is a key element of the changes in production. Standardised work. To meet the requirements of the old ISO TS 16949, you had to have documented work instructions for the production process. Now we see the term used, standardised work, and within that standardised work, we have to consider operator safety. So although we're talking about a quality management system, we also need to think about the safety of the operator. And finally, a process flow. We need to make sure we've got a process flow not only linked to the FMEA and the control plan, but the process flow is clearly linked to the product, the process, and the tooling that we're going to be using within the manufacturing process. So these are some of the things that we need to consider in the how part of the turtle diagram to make an effective transition for production. Now let's think about the with what part of the turtle diagram for production. So the first thing that we need to think about is if we build, as part of design and development, we build error-proofing devices into the process, we need to make sure we have a formal system to make sure those error-proofing devices are working. So we need to make sure that we've got controlled, verified, and where applicable, calibrated challenge parts, rabbits or master samples as they're sometimes called. That periodically the operator checks that the error-proofing devices are working by putting a good part through the process and putting a no good part through the process, and making sure that the error-proofing device is spotting the good part from the no good part. Many companies do this, but often this process is not formally documented. Now we need to demonstrate documented information that that is working effectively. We need to make sure physically that any scrap parts as part of the production process are rendered unusable prior to the disposition of those products, because we don't want any of those scrap parts finding their way into the automotive supply chain, either for original equipment or for any aftermarket application. So we need to make sure it's rendered as unusable. The final thing is about having effectively maintained machines, effectively maintained tools, and facilities, including handling and ergonomic requirements. So I think maintenance is even stronger now in IATF 16949, that we've got an effective total preventive maintenance system that may include some operator maintenance to make sure that we're keeping the equipment in optimum condition to make sure it's capable of meeting the customer requirements. So these are some of the changes physically we need to consider within the production process. So what about the people that are working within production? Well, obviously previous versions of ISO TS 16949 required that we had competent people, whether those people are full-time employees within the organisation or whether they're contract employees, that we need to make sure they're competent to perform their role. That requirement hasn't changed. But we need to make sure that we've got documented information to show that people understand basic statistical concepts, whether involved in collecting statistical data, analysing statistical data, or managing statistical data. That we've got competent people that understand the basic statistical concepts. The next, I think there's more emphasis on, is about all employees working in production understanding and are aware of the impact upon product quality. For example, if the product doesn't meet the defined quality requirements and maybe we don't do the required checks or inspection, what impact that could have in meeting customer requirements and what risks there could be in the supply chain, including the risks for the end users. So obviously this is particularly important if your organisation is making safety critical product, that the operator really does understand their role in making sure they've done all the checks that are specified within the control plan and the standardised work to make sure the product meets the requirement. And also in production, we need to make sure that we have a process to retain organisation knowledge. So this is making sure that through our skill matrix, we can make sure we have enough people and enough flexibility that we're not reliant on any specific individual, that if that one individual, for example, went on holiday, that we can still keep the production process working effectively. So this organisation knowledge could be maintained by making sure we have adequate trained people, or by making sure we have very detailed standardised work that we can train people in the event that we have not enough labour to perform a specific task. So I think this is one of the fundamental changes in ISO 9001-2015 to make sure we have people with adequate organisation knowledge. So let me try and summarise some of those changes. One of the big changes, I think, is the new requirement related to how do we manage temporary changes of process control. I gave a few examples earlier, but we need to think about how do we manage any changes that we're making to the existing controls that are defined within the control plan. This may be due to unavailability of maybe some measuring equipment, breakdown of some measuring equipment, unavailability of a key production process. How are we going to manage that change? Thinking about the risk within that through the FMEA, thinking about the controls within the control plan, and thinking about the standardised work as to how we communicate that temporary change to the employees working within the process. We need to think about rework and repair. How are we going to manage rework and repair and make sure that we've got enough standardised work and we've considered the risks in rework and repair before we start making the rework and repair. We need to make sure that we have got really robust contingency plans, and where practical, we test those contingency plans to make sure if the situation did arise that the plan would actually work. And in looking at the contingency plan, we need to look at delivery performance to really make sure the contingency plan is there, not just as a paperwork exercise, it's there to make sure we can meet the customer requirements. Next, we need to make sure that our production process and the production layout has adequate capacity to meet the defined customer requirements. Far more emphasis in IATF about capacity. The next thing we need to think about is validation of error-proofing devices, making sure we have formal processes for the validation of these error-proofing devices. Finally, we need to make sure we've got documented standardised work where we take into account operator safety, and we need to make sure, particularly if we're using people that are not speaking the native language, that we're providing this standardised work in a language that can be understood by the relevant personnel. In the changing world economy and with migration of people, I think that is a key requirement that we need to meet. So this is a summary of some of the key changes that affect the production process. We need to consider these changes in making a successful transition to IATF 16949, incorporating the ISO 9001-2015 requirements.